I got drunk and slept on my ex's couch, and when I called it a mistake, my husband's response shocked me to my core. I tried to argue, but he was already packing his bags. 4 years of marriage ended over what I thought was one stupid night. David held those receipts like they were evidence in a murder trial. The first one showed the ride to Ryan's apartment complex. The second one showed the ride home the next morning. There was no denying where I'd been or when I'd been there. David was waiting for an explanation, his voice eerily calm. I felt like I was drowning as I told him it was complicated. His laugh was bitter as he pointed out that I'd disappeared for 8 hours, hadn't answered my phone, and spent the night at some guy's place. He wanted me to make it uncomplicated for him. I tried to deflect by saying it wasn't just some guy, it was Ryan, someone I'd known for years. David's expression grew darker as he asked if I was seriously telling him I'd spent the night at my ex-boyfriend's apartment. The way he said ex-boyfriend made it sound like the most disgusting thing in the world. I scrambled to explain that nothing had happened, that I'd slept on his couch, that I'd been too drunk to drive home safely. David's response cut through all my excuses like a knife. He said that forgetting to pick up milk was a mistake, but planning a meeting with an ex and spending the night at his place was something else entirely. I could see David processing everything, connecting dots I'd hoped he'd never find. He asked how long I'd been talking to Ryan again, and I had to admit it had been about a month. The look on David's face told me he understood this wasn't some random encounter, but something I'd been hiding from him deliberately. Let me explain how I got to this moment, sitting at my kitchen table watching my 4-year marriage potentially crumble over 2 pieces of paper. My name is Mia. I'm 29 years old, and I've been married to David for 4 years. We moved to Portland 8 months ago when David got a promotion at his financial consulting firm. The move was supposed to be a fresh start for us, a chance to build something better together in a new city. David works incredibly long hours in his new position. 60-hour weeks are normal for him, and he often brings work home on weekends. The promotion came with significant financial benefits, but it also came with demands that neither of us had fully anticipated. David would leave the house before 7 in the morning and rarely returned before 8 at night. I work remotely for a marketing agency based in San Francisco, which means I spend most of my days alone in our apartment. The isolation hit me harder than I'd expected. In our old city, I had friends, routines, places I belonged. In Portland, I had David and work, and when David was constantly busy, I really just had work. Our relationship had settled into a predictable routine that felt more like roommates than spouses. David would come home exhausted. We'd eat dinner while he scrolled through work emails on his phone. We'd watch Netflix until he fell asleep on the couch, and then we'd repeat the cycle the next day. Romance had been replaced by discussions about mortgage payments and grocery lists. I started feeling invisible in my own marriage. When I tried to talk to David about feeling disconnected, he'd apologize and promise to make more time for us, but then another urgent project would come up and his attention would shift back to work. I began to feel like I was married to his career rather than to him. Ryan messaged me on Instagram 6 weeks ago. The message was simple enough. He'd seen that I'd moved to Portland and mentioned that he was there too for work. He suggested we meet for coffee sometime to catch up. I stared at that message for an hour before responding. Ryan had been my college boyfriend, the relationship that had defined my early 20s. We'd dated for 2 years in university, and it had been passionate, intense, everything I thought love should be when I was 21. He'd broken up with me because he wasn't ready for anything serious, which had devastated me at the time. I'd spent months wondering what I could have done differently to make him stay. I should have deleted his message. I should have told David about it immediately. Instead, I wrote back that coffee sounded nice. It seemed harmless enough, just 2 old friends catching up. We met at a cute coffee shop downtown. Ryan looked incredible. Success suited him well. He'd started his own digital marketing firm, drove a Tesla, and lived in one of those luxury high-rises overlooking the river. But more than his material success, He seemed genuinely interested in my life, my work, my thoughts in a way that David hadn't been in months. Ryan remembered everything about me. My favorite coffee order, the way I gestured when I got excited, the novel I'd been trying to write in college. He asked about my dreams, my goals, whether I felt fulfilled in my life. These were questions David hadn't asked me in years. We talked for 3 hours. When David came home that night and asked about my day, I said I'd worked and run errands. The lie slipped out so easily it scared me, but I told myself I was just avoiding unnecessary complications. Ryan and I started texting after that coffee meeting. Nothing inappropriate at first, just old friends reconnecting. But gradually, the conversations became more personal. He'd ask how I was really doing, if I was happy, if I felt appreciated. Questions that highlighted everything that was missing from my marriage. One evening, Ryan texted asking if David really saw me, the real me. I stared at that message while David sat 3 feet away on the couch, absorbed in his laptop. When was the last time David had asked me about my dreams? When was the last time we'd talked about anything deeper than household logistics? I texted back that sometimes I felt invisible. That simple admission opened floodgates I didn't even know existed. Ryan began sharing his own perspective on relationships and personal fulfillment. He said he'd learned from his failed marriage that life was too short to settle for comfortable, when you could have extraordinary. He suggested that many people stayed in relationships out of habit rather than genuine connection. Our text conversations became the highlight of my day. I'd wake up hoping for a message from Ryan, and I'd go to bed disappointed if I hadn't heard from him. I started comparing everything David did to how Ryan made me feel. David asked about bills. Ryan asked about my feelings. David discussed work schedules. Ryan discussed philosophy and dreams. I was falling into an emotional affair without fully acknowledging what was happening. I told myself we were just friends, that everyone needed someone who understood them, that David was too busy to notice anyway. Ryan suggested we meet for lunch to continue our conversations in person. I agreed, rationalizing that old friends met for meals all the time. We went to a quiet restaurant where we could talk for hours without interruption. During lunch, Ryan told me about his recent divorce. His wife had been successful but emotionally unavailable, too focused on her career to nurture their relationship. He said he'd realized he deserved someone who appreciated him for who he was, not just what he provided. The parallels to my own marriage were obvious and painful. Ryan asked if I felt appreciated by David, if David made me feel special, if our relationship brought out the best in both of us. I found myself admitting that I often felt taken for granted, that David seemed to see me as part of the household infrastructure rather than as someone worth pursuing. Ryan reached across the table and touched my hand while telling me I deserved to feel cherished. The contact sent electricity through me that I hadn't felt in years. I pulled my hand away, but not immediately, and we both noticed my hesitation. These lunch meetings became regular occurrences. Ryan would text me in the morning, asking if I was free, and I'd rearrange my work schedule to accommodate him. I started putting extra effort into my appearance on these days, choosing outfits that were flattering and doing my makeup with more care than I'd used in months. I was careful to delete our text conversations after reading them, not because they were explicitly inappropriate, but because they made me feel guilty in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. When David asked why I seemed happier lately, I deflected by saying I was just adjusting well to Portland. The emotional intimacy with Ryan intensified over the following weeks. He became my confidant, the person I turned to when I needed to feel understood. He validated feelings I'd been suppressing about my marriage and encouraged me to think about what I really wanted from life. Ryan began hinting that our connection was special, that not everyone found someone who truly understood them. He suggested that settling for less than extraordinary was a waste of the limited time we had on Earth. He never explicitly encouraged me to leave David, but he planted seeds of doubt about whether I was living authentically. I started viewing my marriage through Ryan's lens. David's stability became boring predictability. His work ethic became emotional unavailability. His practical nature became a lack of passion. I was rewriting our history to justify the growing emotional distance I was creating. 3 weeks ago, David came home late on a Friday evening and announced that he'd have to work through the weekend on an urgent client project. He apologized and suggested we reschedule our planned dinner date for the following week. I felt a familiar surge of resentment at being deprioritized once again. In my frustration, I impulsively texted Ryan asking if he was drinking anything that night. He responded immediately, suggesting we meet at a trendy cocktail bar downtown. I agreed without hesitation, telling myself I deserved some fun after being abandoned by my husband again. The bar Ryan chose was dimly lit, with an intimate atmosphere that felt more like a date venue than a place for friends to catch up. He'd reserved a corner booth where we could talk privately, and he'd already ordered my favorite wine when I arrived. We talked for hours, drinking more than either of us should have. The conversation flowed easily, touching on our college memories, our current dreams, and our disappointments with how our lives had unfolded. Ryan told me I looked beautiful, that my husband was lucky to have someone so intelligent and passionate. As the evening progressed, our conversation became increasingly personal and flirtatious. Ryan told me he'd never forgotten me, that he'd often wondered what would have happened if he'd been mature enough to commit when we were younger. He said seeing me again had reminded him of what real connection felt like. When last call was announced, Ryan suggested we continue the evening at his apartment. He said he had a good wine collection, and we could listen to music without the bar's noise. I knew I should go home, but David was working late anyway, and I was enjoying feeling desired and interesting for the first time in months. Ryan's apartment was everything mine wasn't. Modern, stylish, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He put on soft music and opened an expensive bottle of wine while I admired the view. The setting felt romantic, in a way my home life had stopped being years ago. We sat on his couch, continuing our conversation about dreams deferred and roads not taken. Ryan moved closer to me as we talked, and I didn't move away. When he put his arm around me, I leaned into him, telling myself it was just comfort between old friends. The moment that changed everything came when Ryan tilted my chin up and leaned in to kiss me. For a split second, I didn't resist. His lips were soft and familiar, and I remembered why I'd been so devastated when he'd left me years ago. But then reality crashed back, and I pulled away, reminding him that I was married. Ryan apologized immediately, saying he'd gotten carried away by the wine and the nostalgic atmosphere. He promised it wouldn't happen again and suggested I should probably head home. But then I made the decision that would destroy my marriage. I told Ryan I was too drunk to drive home safely. I suggested I could sleep on his couch until morning, when I'd be sober enough to get an Uber home. Ryan seemed surprised but agreed, offering to get me pillows and a blanket. But sleeping on the couch felt awkward and formal after the intimacy we'd shared all evening. When Ryan offered to let me sleep in his bed while he took the couch, I initially refused. But he insisted, saying his bed was more comfortable and he didn't mind sleeping on the sofa. I agreed to take his bed, telling myself nothing inappropriate would happen. But when bedtime came, Ryan suggested we could both sleep in the bed, as long as we stayed on our respective sides. He said we were adults who could handle sharing space without it meaning anything. I should have insisted on the couch. I should have called an Uber despite being drunk. I should have called David to pick me up. Instead, I agreed to share Ryan's bed, convincing myself it was just a practical sleeping arrangement between old friends. Lying in bed next to Ryan, I was acutely aware of his presence. Every time he shifted, every time he breathed, I felt it. The tension between us was palpable, even though we weren't touching. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I was doing and why I couldn't make myself leave. Nothing overtly physical happened that night, but boundaries had been crossed in ways that felt almost more intimate than physical contact. I'd chosen to spend the night with another man instead of going home to my husband. I'd prioritized Ryan's comfort and attention over my marriage vows. In the morning, Ryan made coffee and acted like nothing unusual had happened. He was cheerful and casual, asking if I'd slept well and whether I wanted breakfast. His nonchalant attitude made me question whether I was overreacting to what had been, technically, just a practical sleeping arrangement. I called an Uber and returned home before David woke up. He was already in the shower when I arrived, and I had time to change clothes and compose myself before he came downstairs. When he asked if I'd had a good evening, I said I'd met an old friend for drinks and it had gotten late. The lie came so easily that it frightened me. I'd become someone who could look my husband in the eye and deceive him without hesitation. But I told myself I was protecting him from unnecessary hurt over something that hadn't really meant anything. David was in a good mood that morning, apologizing again for working late and suggesting we plan something special for the upcoming weekend. His kindness made my guilt worse, but it also reinforced my rationalization that what he didn't know couldn't hurt him. Over the following days, I tried to return to normal life with David, but everything felt different now. I'd tasted something that had been missing from my marriage, and going back to our routine felt suffocating. I found myself comparing David's every action to how Ryan had made me feel that night. Ryan texted me a few days later, thanking me for a wonderful evening and suggesting we should do it again soon. I should have declined, should have used that moment to establish appropriate boundaries. Instead, I found myself agreeing that it had been nice to reconnect. I began living a double life. During the day, I was David's wife, going through the motions of our established routine. But in my private moments, I was thinking about Ryan, remembering how alive I'd felt in his presence, wondering what might happen if we spent more time together. The guilt was consuming, but I managed to suppress it by focusing on my grievances against David. He worked too much. He didn't pay enough attention to me. He'd stopped making an effort in our relationship. I convinced myself that his neglect justified my emotional infidelity. 2 weeks after that night at Ryan's apartment, David found the Uber receipts that would end our marriage. He'd been looking through our shared email account for tax documents when he noticed the charges. The timing made it obvious that I'd lied about how I'd gotten home that night. When David confronted me with the receipts, I felt my entire world collapsing. There was no way to explain away 2 Uber rides to the same address 8 hours apart. I was forced to admit that I'd spent the night at Ryan's apartment, though I tried to minimize what had happened. David's reaction was devastating in its quiet intensity. He didn't yell or throw things. Instead, he asked careful questions that revealed the full scope of my deception. How long had I been talking to Ryan? How many times had we met? Why had I hidden all of this from him? With each answer, I watched David's trust in me crumble. He pointed out that I'd made a series of deliberate choices, each one taking me further away from our marriage. Meeting Ryan for coffee, continuing to text him, meeting him for lunch, going to the bar, going to his apartment, staying the night. None of these had been accidents or mistakes. I tried to explain my loneliness, my need for connection, my frustration with our relationship dynamics. But David cut through all my justifications with brutal logic. If I'd been unhappy in our marriage, I should have talked to him about it. Instead, I'd chosen to seek emotional and physical intimacy with another man while lying to him about it. David asked the question that broke my heart and his. If our marriage had problems, why hadn't I tried to fix them with him instead of running to my ex-boyfriend? I had no answer that didn't make me sound selfish and cowardly. I tried to convince David that we could work through this, that it had been a mistake I'd never repeat. I promised to block Ryan from all communication, to go to couples therapy, to do whatever it took to rebuild his trust. But David's response crushed my hopes. He said the issue wasn't Ryan specifically, but my capacity to betray our marriage when things got difficult. He said he couldn't trust someone who would cross such fundamental boundaries and then lie about it for weeks. He asked how he could ever believe I wouldn't do it again the next time I felt lonely or unappreciated. David packed a bag that same day and went to stay with his brother. He said he needed time to think about whether our marriage could survive what I'd done. His calm, measured approach was more terrifying than anger would have been. I could see in his eyes that he was already gone, just trying to figure out the logistics of ending things. In desperation, I called Ryan to tell him what had happened. I thought he might offer support, maybe even suggest we could be together openly now that my marriage was falling apart. Instead, his response was cold and distant. Ryan said he thought it was probably best if we didn't communicate anymore. He pointed out that the situation had become complicated in ways he hadn't intended. When I asked if what we'd shared had meant anything to him, he was brutally honest. He said he'd enjoyed reconnecting with me, but he'd never intended to break up my marriage. He'd just been curious about whether we still had chemistry, and now that question had been answered. He suggested I should focus on fixing things with my husband, rather than pursuing something that had always been more fantasy than reality. I realized with horrible clarity that I'd destroyed my marriage for someone who'd never seen me as more than an interesting diversion. Ryan had gotten what he wanted, the satisfaction of knowing he could still attract me. And now he was moving on to whatever came next. David filed for divorce 8 weeks later. He'd spent that time staying with his brother, refusing to see me or take my calls. When the papers arrived, they felt like a death certificate for everything we'd built together. The legal proceedings were straightforward since we'd only been married 4 years and had no children. David kept the house, which was fair since his income had paid most of the mortgage. I moved into a small apartment across town, taking only my personal belongings and half of our modest savings. The worst part wasn't the financial impact or even the loneliness. It was the realization of what I'd given up. David had been a good husband, not perfect but committed, honest, and loving in his quiet way. He'd worked long hours to build a future for us, and I'd repaid his dedication by seeking excitement with someone from my past. I'd convinced myself that I deserved more passion, more attention, more romance than David provided. But in pursuing those things with Ryan, I'd lost the genuine love and partnership that David had offered. I'd traded something real and lasting for something that had been nothing more than nostalgic fantasy. Sitting alone in my apartment 6 months after David moved out, I finally understood the difference between a mistake and a choice. A mistake is forgetting to set your alarm or buying the wrong size shirt. What I'd done was make a series of conscious decisions, each one prioritizing my immediate gratification over my marriage vows. I'd called it a mistake when David confronted me, but mistakes don't require months of planning and deception. Mistakes don't involve creating secret emotional relationships or lying to your spouse's face. What I'd done was choose my ex-boyfriend's attention over my husband's trust, and that choice had predictable consequences. The hardest truth to accept was that David had been right to leave me. Not because I'd slept with Ryan, I hadn't, but because I'd shown him that when our marriage faced challenges, my instinct was to seek comfort outside it rather than work to improve it from within. I'd proven that my commitment had conditions, and those conditions could be undermined by loneliness and flattery. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And I'm curious, what city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever made a choice that seemed small in the moment but changed everything? Share your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next story.